You certainly, and I would say this book in general, got me thinking a lot more thoughtfully and deeply about the difference between a reformer and an abolitionist. You consider yourself an abolitionist, so how would you define what that means for you?
So one thing, people who have been abolitionists far longer than I have and who have really been like the leaders on this movement, they actually tend to push back against like labeling oneself as an abolitionist because they believe that abolition is like a practice. It's something that we are constantly working towards. The goal of abolition is to basically transform the society itself, to eliminate the conditions that result in what we call crime, right? And so I I almost hesitate to put a label on myself and say I am an abolitionist. I consider myself like a student of abolition. I wrote that essay because I do absolutely agree in abolishing police. I mean, I think that when you look at the history of policing in the United States of America, it is tied to slavery. We did not have police forces in this country before slavery. And so when we talk about reforming police and prisons, what are we talking about? You know, Angola it's now Mississippi State Penitentiary is the largest penitentiary in the United States of America. Like 75% or more of the population is Black men. And that began as a plantation. It was Angola plantation, right? That's the history of policing and prisons in America. So if we're talking about reform, what are we reforming? What does that mean to reform the system of policing and prisons? Most recently, they are now talking about let's switch from prisons to mass surveillance. So we don't have to have a physical prison with cages, but we'll create a mass surveillance system that is basically like an open air prison, right? That's what reform is. Reform is like we never get free. We just keep like literally reforming the system that originally had us in literal shackles and chains.
Yeah, and I don't think a lot of people are very aware of the for-profit
Oh
element of
yeah.
prisons. Like it's huge. I mean, I don't remember. It wasn't with the Mississippi State Prison. It was. I don't remember what head of a prison just recently said this about how they could not ever shut the prison down because of the amount of money it brings into the community per year. So they have a vested interest in arresting people. And we know that ain't gonna be arresting a whole lot of white people.
Yeah.
They're arresting what has always been the free labor source for them in this country, which is us.
It's an industry. It's an industry. And the thing is like when people say things like, well, what about safety? How do we address violence? But the thing is policing and prisons are violence. Like, I could entertain the discussion if you could show me that police and prisons are actually preventing violence. They are not. They are not. The data shows that police actually have virtually no impact on the amount of violence that's happening in a community, and they add to the violence. So if you think about like the number of like riots or unrest that we've had in this country in recent years, they were all tied to policing, including January 6th. You had police participating in the attacks on Capitol police officers, right? The prisons are sites of rape and torture and murder. These are not things that are reducing violence. They add to the violence that we have in our society. So we have to find another way. Nobody wants more violence. We're not saying like let's just do nothing to address violence. We're saying that what we have right now is not addressing violence. We've got to do something else.
Let's not even get into the fiscal irresponsibility. You have these police
Oh
departments that are
yeah.
getting billions of dollars and can't solve a crime. And then you look at what their ability to solve, just say homicides is and how low of a percentage that is. And I'm like, wait, that's considered a success? Because I know in my job, if I was only 10% successful at it, I'd probably be
Right.
fired. Yeah.
Right. Right. But
Um,
they get more money.
but they get
They
even
get
more
more
money
money.
because,
Yeah.
I think that's part of our country is like we like to make people feel safe, right? Not you actually are safe. I
Right.
compared to almost like the airport, right? Once my man lit his shoes on fire and we all had to start taking off our shoes.
Right.
But it's like, does that really make us safer? Does the 3 ounces versus 6 ounces really make us safer?
Certain people get to feel safe. That's the other thing too. Only certain people get to have what makes them safe. Communities everywhere are like, you know what would make us feel more safe if we had housing. if we had transportation, if we had safe streets, if we had, well-funded education, and those communities are told no, like you don't get to determine what is safety, because we only define safety as what makes, the wealthy people in the gated community say that they feel safe, and that's having police surrounding your community. So it's not everybody doesn't get to define safety.
I do want to ask you a question about housing, but before I do, I want to ask you about something else. Another passage you wrote in the essay that you had, which make sure that I tell everybody the title of the actual essay, "Putting a Black Face on Police Agendas," because the whole construct of your essay is just about how we often see, people say a solution into solving, the policing issue in America is more Black cops, right? And so you're attacking that notion that the presence of Black police officers still doesn't do anything to fix the system. So anyway, you write, the current political divide on this issue falls exactly along these lines, separating those who think the system is simply in need of reform and those who correctly define the problem as the system itself. The reality is that Black people fall on both sides of this divide, which is why we find so many Black officers in uniform arguing for a reformist agenda, even as every reform they propose is vociferously opposed by the powerful majority white police unions and most of the rank and file.
Mm-hmm.
That is a hell of a observation. You mentioned that the root causes need to be eliminated first if we want to address policing, but when it comes to specifically addressing Black people's participation in these systems and really in white supremacy to some degree, even though we certainly wouldn't look at it like that, how can we begin to recognize what our own participation is in things like this?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of it ties back to whether or not folks have an analysis or understanding around what racial capitalism is, in my view, right? And what I mean by that is like really understanding that the organization of our modern society, and especially if you're talking specifically about America, but it's a global system, right? But let's just talk about the United States. The United States is a white settler colonialist state. That's how it began. The capitalist system, the founding of the capitalist system was slavery. And see, that's one of like, that is in my view like the foundational truth that they want to strip from historical memory. That's why they still going on about 1619 Project. Nicole Hannah Jones published this thing. She still got them going crazy over 1619 Project, because to have that understanding of how slavery really is the economic basis, not just the economic basis, but like the social basis for our society and how it's organized. And what that means is like Black people, as people of African descent, we were reduced to capital. We were used as like goods. I mean, the same way that you insure your house, people would insure us. You had insurance policies on people. You could take a family, you could take a woman and a man and say, okay, I'm going to make an investment here. I'm going to get 10 children out of them. And now I have increased my wealth. I mean, that's how we existed in this system. And so I think there are people who have that understanding that the system itself is anti-Black, right? So just because you put on a uniform and you have a certain post within the system does not mean that the system itself has transformed. Another example that I would use is like being a Black overseer does not change the dynamic of the plantation. There were Black slave owners. We know that. It doesn't change the dynamic of the plantation. There were free Black people who lived among people who were enslaved. Does not change the dynamics of the slave system. And so to me, that is where the difference in understanding comes. Again, what are you reforming when you say you believe in reform? What are you reforming? Like, do you have an understanding of what the system is that you are trying to reform, and why are we trying to reform it? The land is stolen. Again, like we have to ignore certain truths in order to arrive at this understanding that the system just needs some tweaking here and there. No, like the wealth is stolen. The whole reason that we have a racial wealth gap, the whole reason that we have Black people living disproportionately in poverty and Indigenous people living on reservations is because the land was stolen, and we've never dealt with that original issue.
Mm.
So what are we reforming?
So I'm sure you've heard the old adage, keep doing what you're doing, you're gonna keep getting what you're getting,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
So why do you think we cling so much to the idea of reform?
I don't think there's a lot of exposure to alternatives. Like, so I want to be clear. Like the analysis that I have today, I didn't have this analysis 10 years ago. I definitely would have been in the reformist camp. I had this understanding of like there were these injustices that happened, a long time ago. And of course the system is not entirely fair, but if we run for office and we get in certain positions and we change the laws, then we can change the thing. And we can make it more fair for everyone. And then I started to develop a more of an analysis around how power actually operates. That laws and policies are not neutral things. The government is not a neutral thing. It all comes down to who holds power. There's no consistency in the way anything is handled, except to uphold racism. So we saw, like, for instance, one set of rules when Barack Obama was in office, and now it's a completely different set of rules when Trump was in office. You can't reform something like that. That's not about reform. That's a raw struggle for power between groups that are in fundamental disagreement about what the country is supposed to be. And I think that's kind of what we are seeing playing out now. And so I think that there's a lot of things that we are taught to not question. I think that's again why we have this battle that's going on in education right now, because they are afraid of having a generation that is exposed to truths that might cause them to question things that we take for granted and accept, right? Like we can't have universal housing, we can't have universal health care. There's only so much we can do. And to me, that's where reform exists. Reform exists in this box that has limited our imagination around what the society could be. And so I think there are a lot of people who are very well-meaning, who identify as reformists. They are very well-meaning people. I just think that they are operating with a limited analysis. And I think that they are operating with a limited imagination around what is possible. Who says we can't abolish the police? Why not? The police didn't always exist. Who says that we can't add more people to the Supreme Court, or abolish the Supreme Court, or abolish the Senate? Like, all of these things are creations that we have the power to change as we need to, in order to be able to live as free human beings.